When I was a student, I got called in on a stroke patient. She had coded, and they were doing CPR. They worked for 45 minutes, but she died. They cleaned her up and called on the family to say goodbye, but by that time the family left. She had been both brain dead and without a pulse for more than 45 minutes. Blood had filled her brain, and she was completely gray and started to smell. Suddenly, she sat up and called for her family. The nurses rushed to get monitors and equipment back on her. They started working on her again. She stabilized, said goodbye to her family, and promptly died a second time. I had an old lady come in by ambulance, near death. She was a do not resuscitate, so we weren't going to do much for her. She didn't have any family that we could find. The hospital was full, so we had to keep her in the emergency room for the night. Again, she was near death. When you've seen enough people die, there's no mistaking it, and she was almost there. Barely responsive. Pale, cool breaths were really irregular. Heart rate was up and down too. We just turned the lights down and kept an eye on her monitor, basically waiting for her to die. About an hour later, she's standing at the door of her room. She'd gotten up and put on all her clothes. We were all like, what the hell? One of the nurses went to check on her, and she said she was hungry. Not knowing really what to make of things, we got her a chair, a bedside table, and went to the cafeteria and got her a tray of food. She sat there, ate all her food, and talked with the staff a little. After about an hour, she told her nurse that she was tired and wanted to lie back down. We helped her back into bed, and within 30 minutes she was dead. I used to work in a skilled nursing facility, usually assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. One night, I'm in the linen room stocking my cart, and I heard someone shuffle up behind me. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around, and there was no one else in the room. The door was still shut too. Another lady started to complain that a man was coming into her room at night. Again, Alzheimer's, so I didn't think much of it. So to reassure her, I told her I'd check on her throughout the night. She complained of this man for every night for 2 more weeks when I asked her to describe him to me. He's real handsome and wears a black suit. Oh, he's right behind you now, honey. That freaked me out. Of course, there was no one behind me. She died the next night in her sleep. I work in long-term care currently, where a lot of palliative residents always claim to hallucinate either small dogs or it's either children eating ice cream before they die. It's always facility specific too. One facility I work at, I have had about 6 or 7 residents claim to see a little girl eating ice cream, and then they die later that night. I'm going to find that little girl. She's causing me so much paperwork. I'm a registered nurse, and while I was a student, I was caring for a lady who had end-stage renal failure, had a do not attempt resuscitation, and was shutting down. We were having a little chat when she stopped, looked over my shoulder and said, "Bill's here, love. I've got to go," and swiftly stopped breathing. Read her old notes, and Bill was her deceased husband. About 2 years ago, we treated patients during a fungal meningitis outbreak. Our acute care floor has a census of 20. During this, at least 10 to 15 were meningitis patients, ages ranging from 20s to 90s. There are no shared rooms, and all the patients were in isolation, no contact with one another. Many of them had the same hallucinations, children in the corners of their rooms and auditory hallucinations of religious music. I did my clinical as a certified nursing assistant in a memory care unit. I helped feed this woman who never really moved, never talked. It was like she was in a coma or something, and I could hardly get any real food in her, though I was able to slide in some special ice cream. For days, she wouldn't move or have any response. I'm feeding her and talking to myself pretty much. After about 10 minutes, she slowly turns her head and says, "Oh, hello." Then she rotates her head back to her blank staring position. Super creepy. A guy coded in my mother's emergency room, and after a while, they cease CPR. A few moments go by, and the guy sprung forward, said something unintelligible, and died again. The family was in the room, or in the area when it happened. When I took my emergency medical technician class, the teacher said they had a guy that they worked after he had drowned. Said they were in the process of zipping up his body bag, as he had been dead for about 15 minutes, and he sat up and asked what they were doing to him. He was a paramedic for 25 years. Night nurse for 4 years now at an old folks' home. I had a palliative who couldn't sleep because of incredibly vivid hallucinations. She would describe voodoo people around her room that would just stare at her waiting for her to die. I didn't take it seriously until the lady across the hall, who rarely ever spoke, starting seeing them in her room too. Legitimate shivers. I was looking after a patient who needed one-on-one care when I still worked at one of the public hospitals. She had vivid hallucinations of people crawling on the floor and touching the feet, legs of anyone not in bed. She went on to describe in great horror story type detail the person she saw touching my feet, while I sat in a chair next to her for part of my shift. Used to work in a personal care home. A couple of times, a day or so after a resident had passed, their call bell would go off in their room. No one was in the room when the call bell went off on any of the occasions. We had one resident die pretty traumatically. Nurses had to perform CPR because he was a full code. That night, the midnight staff said they saw him at the end of the hall just walking down like he always did. Then, the alarm on the door to the outside, it was a secured unit for Alzheimer's, went off. It was the door he always tried when he was looking to get out. I work in a cardiovascular surgical ICU. We have a lot of messed up people, both physically and mentally, that come through our unit. We had a stretch of nights where each corner room of our unit, it is a perfect square, reported seeing a cat walking around. Not a friendly cat either, apparently. The thing was hissing at them. The accounts were so similar to each other. We actually spent probably a half hour looking around for a cat, and then had security come look as well. No cat was ever seen or found. 2 of those 4 patients coded the next day. I am a therapist in an acute, long-term care facility. We have 4 main hallways. A lot of the action is on 302B. Residents will hear this little boy laugh. Some see him, some just hear him. They play with him and let him sit on their laps. It's very strange to see how comfortable a 98-year-old woman feels when talking to a little boy ghost. I work a telemetry floor on the night shift. Most of our patients are elderly. Apparently, there are 2 things that patients see before they pass away. Some will say that 2 men are walking in their rooms and telling them to get ready to leave. The patient will call and tell us that these men are big and abrasive in their demeanor. They are either terrified or annoyed when they see the 2 men. The other thing they will see is a little boy who will go into their rooms and try to wake them up. The boy is usually loud and runs around their rooms. The patients will call and ask who's letting children just run around late at night. Several nights, or even that same shift, we're coding or cleaning the patient for the funeral home to pick up. I work nights in a long-term care facility as a nurse's assistant. I have 2 men under my care, and both of them are unable to use their call lights. They have severe dementia and debilitating Parkinson's disease, but still their lights are looped around their bed rail. One night their light came on, and I went to answer it already confused and creeped out. I turned it off and left the room. Before I could get 2 doors up, the light came back on. I went in there and both lights were unplugged from the wall and thrown under their beds. I fished them out, plugged them back in and left. I've seen shadows standing over the dying and felt a tap on my shoulder while doing chest compressions, so I knew that lady had passed. My town has 2 really old hospitals. One no longer functions overnight, and the stories are unsettling. No one cleans the old emergency room alone because all the lights and call bells go off. On other floors, there's a kid with his ball, a lady in a white dress, etc. A coworker was cleaning an entire floor utterly solo and bounced between rooms because the cleaning solution stays wet for a few minutes. Upon returning to a freshly wiped bed, handprints were clearly visible. Patient had passed away during my shift. The patient was well known and liked on the ward. At the handover that evening, I mentioned the patient had passed away, and the door to the handover room, which I had closed, opened and shut just as I mentioned she had passed away. She was totally saying goodbye. Later that month, we were chatting about said patient at the nurse's station. Weirdly, a card which was pinned on a notice board fell just as we started talking about her. Went to pick it up. It was a card from the patient's family saying thanks for caring for their parent. When my mom worked as an emergency nurse, a guy came in from a car accident and was losing blood. In the midst of resuscitation, the man jolts awake and screams, "Don't let me go back there. Please, please, please don't let me go back." A few seconds later, they lost him. I work in the memory care unit. I'm a certified nursing assistant. We have a room that's a solo bed at the end of the hall with a woman who cannot move her body. She's pretty far gone memory-wise, so when her call light goes off, it's terrifying to go reset it. She can't push it. We blame the cat a lot, but several times it was locked in another room. I worked as a med tech at an assisted living facility. One day, a resident, I'll call her Margaret, suddenly passed away, and her family left all her belongings in the room that night, including her pendant, to call the staff for help. The next night, Margaret's neighbor called the staff because someone was talking in the room next door and keeping them awake. We brushed the resident off, knowing that Margaret's room was empty. About an hour later, Margaret's pendant started going off from her empty apartment. I was the only one willing to go turn it off, so I walked into the room, and it was freezing cold in the middle of summer. The air conditioning was off. Suddenly, the bathroom door slammed as I was turning off the pendant light. I locked the door and ran back to the nurse's station. We forced one of the older male staff members to go check out the entire room, and he claims the door was still locked when he got down there, and no one was in there. My aunt is a nurse and told me some stories, but this one stuck with me. There was an old lady who insisted on being strapped down at night in her bed. She told my aunt that there was a dark figure that was trying to grab her and take her out of the room, where she would die. My aunt and other nurses obliged, and for the next few nights, she would check on her, and it would look as though someone was trying to pull her from the bed randomly while she slept. My aunt is then off, and whoever is this lady's nurse does not strap her down at night. Nurses found the old lady dead, laying on the floor by the door, her hand stretched out past the door and into the hallway. I am a psychiatrist, and during my training years, I worked for 6 months at a ward treating patients with depressive and anxiety disorders. It was an old building that had been housing psychiatric patients since the mid-1920s. On our floor, we had 13 beds and a nurse's station, a living room, and a few conference rooms. One day, a few weeks in, I am interviewing a patient who, when asked about sleeping patterns, tells me she heard a baby crying at night, waking her up. There are no babies in that hospital, as the place is situated far away from housing areas, and there were restricted visiting hours. Afterwards, the nurse pulls me aside and tells me that the baby crying thing is not a psychotic symptom. She is very serious about this, but won't elaborate. I kind of shrug it off, as either way, it does not change the diagnostic or treatment, and I forget about the experience. Around 3 months in my stay, I sit in the nurse's station, and 3 nurses behind me are talking. One of them says, "She is very active today," and the other says, "Really? Oh, hadn't noticed." I turn around and ask them who they are talking about. They look at each other, and then one of them hesitantly says, "Well, there is a baby here. She cries sometimes." I, of course, say, "No," but they just kind of shrug and smile. Not 30 seconds later, I hear it. It sounded far away, but not too far. A cry, clearly a baby's cry, sounding like it is separated from us by maybe 2 or 3 walls. I am perplexed and look at the nurses. They look at me like, "Told you so." I, of course, ask about this, but they can't say anything else. This faint baby cry is there and has been there always. Since then, I heard it maybe 2 to 3 times a week. I told a new doctor about it, who laughed. However, a few weeks into her stay, she came to me, white as a sheet, and told me she heard it on her coffee break. All the nurses just kind of knew about it, and being in psychiatry, hearing that kind of stuff is not really something you brag about. I was transferred and haven't heard it since. I think about it sometimes, but I don't really know what to make of it. I worked in a pediatric hospital and had always heard that the 4th floor right outside our oncology unit was haunted. I worked 3/12s normally, but would pick up overtime and picked up a night shift. I was working in the NICU, which happened to also be on the 4th floor, but on the opposite side. The oncology unit had a staircase that was a shortcut down to the cafeteria, which was on the 2nd floor. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, I was ready to take a short break and wanted a cup of coffee from the cafeteria, so I decided to take that staircase. I walked through the automatic double doors and saw a kid skipping down the hall. I called out to him, as I was afraid a little kid had snuck out of a patient room. As soon as I called out to him, he turned and, in the blink of an eye, totally vanished. A lot of other nurses and doctors had seen the same little kid skipping in that same hallway. Of course, I chalked it up to just exhaustion and didn't really think about it much after that. But you are damn sure I didn't use that hallway at night ever again. I'm an ICU nurse. A patient's son rang the hospital at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, saying he was sure his dad was dying. His dad had had a severe stroke and was doing okay. Recovery would be difficult, but he wasn't expected to die and was pretty stable at the time. I was looking after him, and he was a lot of work because he would try to get up but couldn't walk, so he'd fallen a lot. The son really wanted to come in, even though it's way past visiting hours, but I'll bend the rules for a good cause. I figured, what the heck, it's his Saturday night. Come on in and sit with your dad. Patient died about 2 minutes before the son walked in the door. It was like a switch was turned off. He just died. The last thing he said to me was, "Am I bothering anyone?" I told him, of course not, even though he had some very frustrating behavior because of the stroke. The son just started crying and screaming. I knew it. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Marion Dutchine. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he couldn't talk. but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life, and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night, he just vanished. It was declared an AWOL for years, and finally, he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a Veterans Affairs hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Dutchine, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. He was well fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a haint and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again." Marion paced all day every day, not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open, as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If I told him to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat. But if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing, because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later, I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. A ward I worked on once had a patient who was a psychic medium as a patient. We had a bit of a laugh with her as she was on the ward for a while. She'd had a stroke which affected her mobility, and she would do readings for the staff from time to time. I took it all as just a bit of fun until one evening when she pressed her nurse call buzzer and told us to go check on a patient in a side room as he was dead. We went to check and, sure enough, found that the gentleman had died. Later on, we asked our psychic patient how she had known, and she told us she had seen him coming out of his room obviously distressed. She realized he had died and had to explain to him what had happened and help him to pass over to the light. Now, I am not a believer, but that gave me the creeps. I am a medical student. Back when I was doing an internship at an obstetrics hospital, I usually ended my night shift at around 2 o'clock in the morning. As I walked back to my quarter, I would occasionally see a baby girl, probably 5 to 7 years old, running and playing in the hall. When I brought this up with one of my professors, he just told me to turn a blind eye. According to him, they were just playing and would do no harm if you pretend you didn't see them. Worked in a nursing home, long-term facility for multiple years. Personally hadn't experienced anything too crazy apart from mystery call lights. Call bell system going off, no buttons lit up, no rooms lit up. System would have to be reset from the electrical room to clear it. Hearing doors close shut, toilets flushing, faucets running. These were by no means commonplace. Other staff had some more direct experiences though. Apparently in one hall, A little girl would occasionally be seen walking. This had been reported by multiple staff, as well as patients. A staff member was sitting out in her car during the night shift when some woman knocked on her window and quickly disappeared. The next day, she was discussing this out loud with the oncoming shift when someone pulled out a picture from old files based on the description provided. Apparently, it was a match to a former patient that had passed away at least 10 years before that staff member was hired. In med school, we had an anatomy exam on November 1st or 2nd. So, on Halloween night, my roommate and I decided that since everyone else was off partying, this would be a good time to get some uninterrupted studying going. Well, it was already creepy as hell being in the basement of the med school surrounded by cadavers. Well, an hour or so in, we're going through anatomy, and all of a sudden, on the other side of the lab, a faucet suddenly turns on. These faucets are the ones that have motion sensors on them, and we're all the way on the other side of the lab. We were a bit creeped out, but dismissed it. We get back to work, and then it happens again, but on a different side of the room, again far from where we are. This happens maybe 2 more times over the course of an hour or so. Finally, we've had enough, and we decide to leave. As we're gathering our stuff and heading out, we remark to each other about a side room where the instructors will prep their lectures and exams, etc. We decide to pop our head in to see what was in there, and we stop dead in our tracks. Like I said, we were the only ones in the lab, and we hadn't heard anyone else come in. In the side room, there is some person that we don't really recognize bent over, working on a cadaver. Their back is to the door, and my friend and I were being plenty loud, yet they remain hunched over, working on the dead body. We have no idea who this strange person is, and we've had it now. We slowly back out and get the hell out of there. First and foremost, thank you for listening, and for your continued support on the channel. It is so deeply appreciated, and I greatly enjoy connecting with every one of you. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more unnerving tales, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Share this video with your friends and comment below. Which of these eerie tales gave you the creeps and chills? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section.